The courtroom was filled with tension, a hum of anxious whispers filling the air as every eye in the room turned to the defendant, John Davis. He was in his late 20s, a striking young man with sharp features and a tall, imposing frame. He wore a tailor-made suit that screamed wealth, the kind that whispered power and authority. But it wasn't just his appearance that commanded attention. It was his attitude. He sat back in his chair with a smirk, his legs casually crossed, as if the entire situation were a joke. His fingers drummed lazily on the armrest, his gaze steady and confident as he stared out at the courtroom, almost daring anyone to challenge him. John had been accused of embezzlement and fraud, stealing millions from his own company, a company he had built from the ground up. But despite the gravity of the charges, John seemed utterly unfazed. His lawyer had made his case with eloquence, presenting all the facts, all the evidence. But none of it seemed to matter. John wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, floating high above the proceedings, immune to the impending consequences. The judge, Sarah Wheeler, sat behind her bench, her gaze steady as she flipped through the pile of paperwork in front of her. Her expression was unreadable, but those who knew her could see the steel beneath her calm exterior. She had presided over many cases, but this one was different. She wasn't fooled by John's arrogance. She had seen men like him before, and they often underestimated her resolve. "Mr. Davis," Judge Wheeler's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering, cutting through the murmur of the courtroom. "Do you understand the seriousness of the charges against you?" John didn't flinch. His smirk widened as he leaned slightly forward, meeting her gaze. "Of course, Your Honor." "I've heard it all before," he said, his voice smooth, dripping with arrogance. "I know how these things go. You do your job, and I'll go back to mine. It's all just a formality, isn't it?" A murmur swept through the room, and several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Judge Wheeler remained unmoved, her eyes narrowing behind the rim of her glasses. John's lack of respect was palpable, his cocky attitude radiating from him like an impenetrable shield. But the judge wasn't going to let him off that easily. "I ask you again, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice cold. "Do you understand the consequences? You're not above this court." John chuckled, clearly entertained by her persistence. "Consequences?" he repeated with a shrug. "Please, Your Honor. I'm not the one who should be worried here. I'll walk out of this courtroom just like I always do. Let's skip the theatrics and get to the part where I'm free." The room fell silent. People looked around, exchanging stunned glances. Even John's lawyer seemed taken aback. The audacity of his words hung in the air, making everyone tense, but Judge Wheeler's face remained stoic, almost unreadable. "You will not mock this court, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "Show some respect." But John wasn't done. "Respect is earned, Your Honor," he scoffed. "And frankly, I don't think you've earned mine. You're just a figurehead here. I'm smarter than you, and I always will be." The words hit like a slap, sending a ripple through the courtroom. A stunned silence followed, the weight of his disrespect hanging heavy. Judge Wheeler's knuckles whitened around the gavel, but she remained composed. John, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the tension. His smirk never wavered. "Enough," Judge Wheeler said sharply, her voice cutting through the room. "You are on the verge of contempt of court, Mr. Davis. Watch your tone." John raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Contempt? Please, Your Honor. You think you can intimidate me? It's you who should watch your tone." He leaned back in his chair again, that same arrogant grin never leaving his face. "But hey, it's all good. I'll leave here with my head held high. You'll see. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. People exchanged looks, unsure of what was going to happen next. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone waiting for Judge Wheeler's response. Then, without warning, she slammed the gavel down. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and forceful, silencing the entire space. "Mr. Davis," Judge Wheeler said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that could not be ignored. "You've made a grave mistake. Your arrogance has clouded your judgment. You thought you could mock me and get away with it, but you're wrong." John leaned forward now, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. "What's the verdict, Your Honor? You going to throw me in jail for speaking my mind?" Judge Wheeler's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "You'll find out, Mr. Davis," she said slowly, her voice cold. "But this isn't what you expect." For the first time, John's confidence seemed to waver. He stood up abruptly, his eyes flashing with a mix of disbelief and defiance. "What do you mean? What's going to happen?" Judge Wheeler's voice remained steady as she delivered her sentence. "You will serve your time in a way you never imagined," she said. "You will spend the next year working with the very people you've hurt, the victims of your fraud. You will learn what it truly means to respect others, whether you want to or not." The room went completely still. John's face drained of color as the weight of her words sank in. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. This wasn't what he had expected. He had expected a slap on the wrist, maybe some time in prison, but not this. "You'll work in a shelter for people who've been victims of financial fraud," Judge Wheeler continued. "You'll help them rebuild their lives. And if I feel for even a second that you're not taking this seriously, I'll bring you right back here for more severe consequences. Do I make myself clear?" John's heart pounded in his chest. His arrogance had been his shield for so long, but now it seemed like the one thing that would fail him. He stood there, stunned, his mind racing. There was no way out of this. He had to face what he had done, and it terrified him. For the first time, John realized that maybe, just maybe, his world was about to change in a way he hadn't anticipated. John Davis walked out of the courtroom, his head still spinning from the judge's final words. The air outside was cooler than he remembered, and for the first time that day, he felt a knot form in his stomach. The weight of the gavel slamming down echoed in his ears, reverberating through his mind. He had been so sure that his wealth, his status, would shield him from any real consequence. But now, here he was, sentenced to a year of community service. And not just any community service. The judge had made it clear. He was to work directly with the victims of his own crimes. A black sedan pulled up, and a uniformed officer stepped out to escort him to the shelter. John climbed into the back seat, his thoughts racing. He had always lived in a world where money and influence were the keys to everything. He had been at the top, untouchable. His empire had been built on manipulation, cunning, and taking advantage of those who were beneath him. Now, he was being sent to face the very people he had wronged. "Where are we going?" John asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced over at John through the rearview mirror. "You'll see when we get there." John's fingers drummed on the seat, his mind churning with frustration. He had expected to waltz out of this trial with a fine at worst, maybe a few months behind bars, but nothing like this. Community service, with the victims of fraud. It felt like a punishment more fitting for someone who had murdered, not a businessman who'd simply been a little too ambitious. But as the car rumbled through the streets, John couldn't shake the feeling that his entire world was unraveling. The car came to a halt in front of a dilapidated building. It was a far cry from the sleek, glass and steel skyscrapers he was used to. The shelter looked tired and worn, the windows grimy, the paint chipped. A small sign hung crookedly over the door, reading, Hope Shelter. John couldn't help but sneer at the irony of the name. Hope? It was a place where broken people came to lick their wounds, and John wasn't sure he belonged here at all. The officer led him inside, and John immediately felt the atmosphere shift. The air was thick with the smell of stale food, cleaning supplies, and something else, a mixture of hardship and desperation. The walls were covered with flyers and posters about financial literacy and rebuilding lives, a stark reminder of the very crimes John had committed. He swallowed hard, trying to suppress the discomfort rising in his chest. "You'll be working under Mrs. Thompson's supervision," the officer said, pointing toward a woman sitting at a desk near the entrance. "She runs this place." John didn't respond. He wasn't interested in talking, not yet. His mind was still processing what had just happened, but he couldn't ignore the woman's gaze. Mrs. Thompson was a middle-aged woman, dressed in plain, practical clothes. She had a warm expression, but there was a strength in her eyes that John couldn't ignore. She wasn't someone to be taken lightly. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm but firm, as she stood to greet him. "I'm Mrs. Thompson. I understand you've been sentenced to work here for the next year." John glanced at her briefly, then turned his gaze away. "Yeah, looks like it. So what exactly am I supposed to do here?" Mrs. Thompson didn't flinch at his dismissive tone. "You'll be helping with various tasks around the shelter. Food preparation, cleaning, assisting the residents, people who've been impacted by financial fraud. Most of them have been where you are now, victims of people like you." She paused, letting that sink in. John felt a flicker of discomfort, but quickly suppressed it. "Yeah, sure, whatever. Just tell me what to do." She nodded. "Follow my instructions, and maybe you'll start to understand what this is all about." John followed her through the shelter's corridors, his mind preoccupied with the weight of his sentence. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. The residents, many of whom looked much older and weary than he had imagined, moved around the shelter in a quiet, resigned way. There were no vibrant personalities, no sense of hope, just people existing in a space that felt like it had forgotten them. He could feel their eyes on him as he walked past, some with curiosity, others with distrust. He was an outsider here, and he didn't know how to fit in. Mrs. Thompson led him to the kitchen, where a few of the residents were busy preparing dinner. A man with a graying beard looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing as he took in John's expensive suit and polished appearance. "Mrs. Thompson, this the new guy?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "John Davis," Mrs. Thompson said. "He's here to help, at least for now." The man grunted, but didn't say anything more. John looked around, suddenly self-conscious of the way he stood out among the others. He was used to being the one in charge, the one people looked up to. But here, he was just another person who had messed up. "Start by chopping vegetables," Mrs. Thompson instructed. "It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary. Everyone here is working towards something. Recovery, rebuilding their lives. We don't have time for egos." John's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He picked up the knife and began chopping, the rhythmic motion helping to calm his thoughts for a moment. But that calm didn't last long. A voice from across the room broke through his concentration. "Hey, you're new here, right?" A man with a rough, weathered face approached him, eyeing him curiously. "Never seen someone like you around before." John glanced up, annoyance flashing across his face. "What do you mean, someone like me?" he shot back, trying to mask his discomfort. The man shrugged. "You know, Someone who looks like they've never done a day's real work in their life. John clenched his fists at his sides, but he said nothing. Instead, he focused on his task, the anger simmering just below the surface. "Whatever," he muttered. "I'll be gone soon enough." The man didn't respond, but John could feel the weight of his words. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. This wasn't just a temporary setback. This was real, and it was only just beginning. As the evening wore on, John found himself lost in thought. The residents of the shelter, though quiet and reserved, seemed to move with purpose. They had lives to rebuild, stories to share, stories that John had never taken the time to understand before. He had always been so focused on himself, so caught up in his own world of wealth and power, that he had never considered the struggles of people like them. The question that lingered in his mind, though, was simple. How long would it take before he could escape this place? How long before he could put it all behind him and go back to the life he knew? But the more he worked, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was something here worth facing. Something he hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long time, John Davis wasn't sure of the future. And that feeling, though unsettling, had a strange pull on him. The days blurred together for John Davis. At first, the work felt beneath him, preparing meals, scrubbing floors, helping residents with tasks they could easily do themselves. Every day, he found himself resisting the urge to complain, to lash out, to remind everyone that he didn't belong here. He had worked in boardrooms, attended lavish parties, rubbed elbows with CEOs, and charmed his way through every business deal. Now, he was washing dishes in a dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by people who had long given up on their own success. It was a world he didn't understand, and for the first time, it felt like a prison. But there was something about the place that gnawed at him. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of menial work. It was the way the shelter had a strange rhythm to it, a sense of quiet, determined resilience that came from the people who lived here. They had seen hardship. Some had been victims of financial fraud, like him, but they were still trying to make their lives better, even in the face of all the damage that had been done to them. And that, in itself, was something he couldn't ignore. It was early on the third day of his sentence that John first noticed the cracks in his arrogance. As he chopped vegetables in the kitchen, his thoughts began to drift from his usual self-absorbed rants to something more unsettling. He thought about the lives he had ruined, the people whose trust he had betrayed, and the greed that had driven him to steal millions from his own company. He had justified his actions for so long, telling himself that everyone in the business world did it, that it was all part of the game. But now, the weight of his choices felt like a heavy burden on his chest. The reality of his situation was inescapable, and he could no longer hide behind the walls of denial. "Hey, you're not from around here, are you?" The voice interrupted his thoughts. John looked up, surprised. A young woman with dark, curly hair stood in front of him, a faint smile on her lips. She was one of the residents, probably in her early 30s, dressed in the shelter's standard-issue clothes. Her eyes were tired, but there was a softness to her expression that John wasn't used to. It made him feel vulnerable. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone defensive, though he couldn't quite place why he was so on edge. "You just seem different," she said with a shrug. "You look like you've never really done a day's hard work in your life." John scoffed. "Yeah, well, I'm not here for a vacation." He turned his attention back to the vegetables, trying to avoid her gaze. The woman didn't push. She simply nodded and stepped back, leaving him to his work. But the encounter lingered in John's mind. For the first time, he felt like an outsider. He had always been the one people looked to for leadership, the one who knew how to manipulate situations to his advantage. But here, in this shelter, he wasn't anything special. He was just another man forced to serve his time. The rest of the day passed in a haze of quiet reflection. As he worked alongside the residents, he couldn't help but listen to their conversations. They spoke of their struggles, how they had been swindled out of their savings, how their lives had been shattered by fraud. Some were angry, others resigned, but all of them seemed to share a determination to rebuild. They didn't have the resources John had, but they had something he had never truly valued before: resilience. When the evening came and John was assigned to help serve dinner, he found himself sitting at one of the long, worn-down tables, surrounded by the other residents. He had been instructed to sit with them and eat his meal as part of his service, but the thought of sharing a table with people like this made him uneasy. He was used to eating alone in the luxury of his office, or with clients who had something to offer him. The idea of breaking bread with these people whose lives he had ruined, felt wrong. But as he sat there, quietly pushing food around on his plate, something strange happened. One of the residents, a man named Tom, with graying hair and deep lines etched into his face, leaned over and looked at John. "So," Tom said, his voice rough but kind, "what brings you here?" John hesitated. The question caught him off guard. He had never had to explain himself to people like this. His usual response was to deflect, to turn the conversation back on himself, or to brush it off entirely. But something about Tom's gaze made him pause. I made some bad choices," John said, his voice trailing off. Tom nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Yeah, we've all made bad choices," he said, his voice quiet. "But it's what you do afterward that matters. You can keep running from it, or you can face it and try to make things right." John didn't know how to respond. He didn't know how to explain that he wasn't used to facing anything, especially not the consequences of his own actions. But something in Tom's words resonated with him. For the first time since he had arrived at the shelter, he felt the stirrings of something other than anger and self-pity. Could it be possible that this place, these people, had something to teach him? The days that followed were filled with more of the same: hard work, quiet reflection, and awkward encounters with the residents. But slowly, John began to notice the small changes within himself. He wasn't as quick to dismiss people anymore. He found himself listening more, observing the way the residents treated one another with compassion, even after everything they had been through. And while he still resented being there, he couldn't deny that a small part of him was starting to feel something he hadn't felt in years: guilt. By the end of the week, John had stopped trying to hide from the work. He wasn't enjoying it, but he had stopped actively resisting it. There was something about the daily rhythm of the shelter, the routines of giving, helping, and rebuilding, that was slowly starting to change him, piece by piece. He still didn't want to admit it, but he was beginning to understand what it meant to serve. And for the first time in a long time, he was starting to see the faces of the people around him, not as victims or outcasts, but as people who had the strength to survive. And as he helped clean up after dinner that night, John realized that he wasn't quite the man he had been when he first walked through the doors of the shelter. He wasn't sure what that meant for the future, but for the first time, he was beginning to think that maybe he wasn't as untouchable as he had once believed. The second week at the shelter was a turning point for John Davis. He had begun to settle into a rhythm, albeit a reluctant one. Every morning, he woke up in a small, sparse room, no larger than a broom closet, with only the bare essentials. It wasn't a luxury suite. It wasn't even close. The bed was small, and the walls were thin, echoing the sounds of the other residents moving about. For someone who had spent years in penthouses with sweeping views and private chefs, this felt like a world apart. His days were spent performing tasks that, though necessary, felt beneath him. He was tasked with sweeping floors, serving meals, and occasionally helping the residents sort through donated clothing. The work was grueling and repetitive, but there was something about it, something about the simplicity of it, that was slowly wearing down the walls John had so carefully built around himself. One afternoon, while wiping down a countertop in the kitchen, John overheard a conversation between two residents. Their voices were low, but not low enough for him to ignore. They were talking about a woman who had recently lost her savings in a fraudulent investment scheme. She was sitting in the corner, her hands trembling as she looked through a stack of bills she couldn't pay. The conversation wasn't about pity. It was about resilience. "You know, she'll come around," one of the men said. "She just needs to see that it's not the end. It's hard at first, but we rebuild." John froze, the rag in his hand suddenly feeling heavy. He had never thought about it that way. To him, the people who were struggling here weren't rebuilding. They were broken. But hearing the words come out of the mouth of someone who had lived through their own hardships, who had experienced betrayal and loss, made him reconsider everything he had thought about people like these. The next morning, while working in the garden area, John was assigned to help a woman named Linda, one of the shelter's long-term residents, with some outdoor maintenance. She was in her late 40s, her face lined with experience, her hair graying at the temples. She had the quiet dignity of someone who had seen it all and still found the strength to keep going. Linda handed him a shovel and gestured to the patch of ground they were supposed to clear. "We need to make this space for a new vegetable garden," she explained. "A lot of people here are trying to get back on their feet, and having a bit of self-sufficiency can do wonders for morale." John took the shovel and began digging into the earth, feeling the weight of each movement. The work was tiring, but it wasn't just the physical labor that was starting to wear on him. It was the way Linda moved, slow but steady, as if every task she performed had meaning behind it. There was no hurry in her actions, no rush to complete the task. She was focused, grounded. It was the first time John had felt like he was working toward something bigger than just a paycheck. "You seem troubled," Linda said, breaking the silence. John paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He hadn't realized how much of his internal conflict was showing on his face. "I don't know," he muttered. "I just feel like I've been running away from everything for so long, and now it's all catching up with me." Linda nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We all have our own battles," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's easy to think that we're the only ones fighting, but everyone has a story. Sometimes it's not about winning the fight. It's about surviving it." John looked at her, confused. "Surviving?" "Yeah," Linda continued. "Surviving means taking whatever life throws at you, and instead of running away, you stand up and keep going. You do what you can with what you have." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had never thought about survival in that way. To him, survival had always meant outsmarting the system, manipulating people, and coming out on top. But here, in this garden with a woman who had clearly seen much harder times than he had, survival seemed to take on a different meaning. It wasn't about winning. It was about finding the strength to endure. As they continued to work in silence, John found himself thinking about his life, the one he had built and the one he had destroyed. He thought about the people he had betrayed, the lives he had ruined. The anger he had felt at being sentenced here slowly started to fade, replaced by something else. It wasn't peace. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a quiet understanding. Later that day, as John walked back into the shelter, he passed a woman sitting near the entrance, a pile of old clothes at her feet. She was sorting through them, trying to find something to wear. Her face was gaunt, her eyes dull, and John felt a pang of guilt as he watched her. He knew he had contributed to the kind of suffering she had experienced. People like him had made her life a living hell. He had taken everything from her, and yet here she was, just trying to survive. It was in that moment that John felt something shift inside him. He didn't know what it was, but for the first time since entering the shelter, he didn't feel above these people. He didn't feel superior. He felt connected to them in a way that was both humbling and terrifying. John had spent his life running away from everything that made him uncomfortable, from the people he had hurt, from the consequences of his actions. But now, as he looked at the woman sorting through clothes, he realized that he couldn't run anymore. Not from this place. Not from himself. And so, the next few days passed in a haze of hard work and quiet reflection. John began to open up to the people around him, even if just a little. He didn't yet fully understand what was happening to him, but he knew one thing for certain. The arrogance that had once been his armor was starting to crack. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he was beginning to face the man he had become. The man who had hurt people, who had taken from them without a second thought. But the biggest question remained. Could he change? Could he make amends for the damage he had caused? Or was it too late for that? As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, John knew that the journey ahead would be harder than anything he had faced before. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. The morning came just like any other. John woke up early, made his way to the communal dining area, and silently joined the rest of the residents in line for breakfast. The routine had become somewhat bearable, even if John was still struggling to fully accept the reality of his situation. There were moments during his daily tasks where he would catch himself feeling like he was just a small cog in a much larger machine. He still didn't feel like he belonged here, but there were flashes of something, a quiet understanding, maybe, that started to break through his walls. But today, something felt different. John had barely taken a seat at the table when he saw a new face walking through the shelter's front door. The man didn't seem to belong here in the same way the other residents did. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and a weathered, hardened look about him. His clothes were simple but neatly pressed, and there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. He carried himself with the kind of authority that John recognized immediately, someone who had seen far too much to be intimidated by anything. "Who's that?" John asked under his breath, glancing around at the other residents, who all seemed to be aware of the newcomer's arrival. "That's Frank," said Linda, the woman he had worked with in the garden the other day. She lowered her voice. "He just arrived a few minutes ago. Been in and out of shelters for a while." John nodded, watching Frank as he moved through the room. There was something unsettling about the man, something that John couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just the way Frank carried himself. It was the way the other residents reacted to him. There was a wariness in their eyes, as though they were trying to gauge whether Frank was a friend or a threat. "You'll get used to him," Linda added, sensing John's curiosity. "Frank's been through a lot, just like the rest of us. But he's a tough one. He's been running from something. Doesn't talk about it much." John's gaze followed Frank as he sat down at a corner table, away from the others. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the presence of this man carried some weight that John couldn't fully comprehend. He had seen people like Frank before, the kind of people who had an air of mystery, a history they were trying to outrun. But in a place like this, where everyone's past was a story of loss and survival, there was something about Frank's demeanor that set him apart. It was as though the man was more than just another resident. He was something else entirely. Later that day, while John was assigned to help with sorting donations in the back room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Frank was watching him. Every time John would glance up, Frank's eyes would be on him, quiet and intense, as though he could see right through him. It was unnerving, the kind of unsettling feeling that made John question everything he thought he knew about himself. The opportunity to speak with Frank didn't come until the following afternoon, when John was cleaning up in the common area after lunch. Frank was sitting at the far end of the room, alone, his gaze fixed on the window. There was something about his stillness, his quiet presence, that drew John in. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to approach him. John took a deep breath and walked over to Frank, not entirely sure what he was going to say. When he reached the table, he hesitated for a moment, trying to figure out how to break the silence. "You don't talk much, do you?" John said, trying to sound casual. Frank looked up at him slowly, his eyes dark and knowing. "I don't need to talk," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I've said enough in my life to last a lifetime." John wasn't sure what to make of that response, but he didn't push. Instead, he sat down across from Frank, still feeling the weight of his own uncertainty. "You've been here long?" John asked, trying to keep the conversation going. Frank shrugged. "Long enough," he said. "I'm here for the same reason you are, to face the mess I've made." The words hung in the air for a moment. There was no judgment in Frank's tone, no pity, just acceptance. John found himself at a loss for words. He had expected Frank to be defensive, to brush him off, but instead, there was a quiet resignation in his demeanor. It was almost as if Frank had already come to terms with everything. "You've got a long road ahead of you," John said, without really thinking about it. Frank gave a short, dry laugh. "We all do," he said, "but it's the road we have to walk, whether we like it or not." There was something about Frank's words that made John pause. He had spent so much of his life running from the consequences of his actions, hiding behind his wealth and influence. But here, in this place, there was no escaping. There were no excuses. There was only the truth. And for the first time, John wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Frank's eyes locked onto John's, and for a brief moment, John felt a strange connection between them. It wasn't the kind of connection he had ever experienced before. There was no camaraderie or understanding in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something that made John question everything he thought he knew about himself. "You're running too," Frank said, his voice soft but direct. John blinked, taken aback. "I'm not running," he shot back defensively. "I'm just here to do my time." Frank raised an eyebrow, as if he knew something John didn't want to admit. "You can't outrun your past. You can't keep hiding from it forever. It's going to catch up with you. It always does." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. He hadn't realized how much of his life had been spent running, avoiding the consequences of his actions, until Frank said it so plainly. And in that moment, John realized something he hadn't allowed himself to understand before. He wasn't just here because of a sentence. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. His past had caught up with him, and it was dragging him into the reality he had spent so long denying. Frank's gaze softened, but there was still a hardness to his eyes, something that told John he wasn't sharing everything. There was more to this man than he was letting on. Something darker, something John couldn't quite understand, but felt was important. And as John walked away from the table, leaving Frank to his thoughts, He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth about Frank's past would eventually come to light. The man had secrets, just like John. And somehow, they were connected, whether they wanted to be or not. The following days at the shelter blurred into a mix of mundane chores, subtle moments of self-reflection, and small interactions with the other residents. John had started to change, albeit slowly. The arrogance he had worn like armor was beginning to chip away, piece by piece, under the weight of his circumstances. He couldn't explain it, but something about being here, surrounded by people who had endured far more than he had, started to shift his perspective. He wasn't quite sure what he was looking for, maybe redemption, maybe understanding, but he knew he had to keep going. Tea was a quiet afternoon when Frank approached him again. This time, John was in the small lounge area, sitting on one of the worn-out chairs, trying to distract himself with a book. Frank, as usual, didn't say much when he sat down beside him. John had become used to his quiet presence, but today there was something different about the way Frank was sitting, tense, like he was holding something back. "Mind if I sit?" Frank asked, his voice as low as ever. John shrugged, not particularly in the mood to talk, but willing to listen. "Sure, if you want to." For a few moments, there was only silence between them. John glanced over at Frank, noticing the distant look in his eyes, the way his fingers fidgeted nervously with a small piece of paper in his hands. It was unlike Frank to show any sign of discomfort. He was usually the one who remained calm, even when everyone else around him seemed to be falling apart. "You know," Frank started suddenly, his voice almost a whisper, "there's something you should know about me." John raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? What's that?" Frank took a deep breath, and for the first time since John had met him, he seemed vulnerable. "I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always the guy you see sitting here." John's curiosity piqued. He had heard bits and pieces of Frank's past from other residents, the fact that Frank had been in and out of shelters for years, that he had made a lot of enemies, but he had never heard the full story. Frank was a man of few words, a man who had kept his secrets close, and John had never pushed him for answers. But now, sitting next to him in this quiet moment, he realized that Frank was offering him something he hadn't expected: the truth. Frank looked down at his hands for a moment before continuing. "I used to have everything. A family, a good job, a house, all of it. And then I threw it all away. All for money. All for power." John stayed silent, his mind racing as Frank's words sank in. He had always thought that people like Frank were beyond redemption, that they had been lost to their own mistakes, forever running from the consequences. But here was Frank, someone who had lived a life of privilege, only to watch it all crumble because of his choices. "I was a con artist," Frank confessed quietly. "Built an empire out of lies. I thought I was untouchable, just like you probably do. But eventually, the lies catch up with you. And when they do, everything you've built falls apart." John swallowed, suddenly finding it hard to breathe. He had been part of that world, the world of lies, of bending the rules, of doing whatever it took to come out on top. It was a world he had thrived in, but now, hearing Frank's confession, it felt hollow. It felt like everything he had ever worked for was based on the same fragile foundation of deceit. "I ruined lives, John," Frank continued, his voice breaking slightly. "People trusted me. I took their money, their hopes, their futures, and I didn't think twice about it. Now, I have to live with that, every single day." John didn't know what to say. He had always believed that people were defined by their actions, that they were either winners or losers, that they either played the game or got played. But Frank's words forced him to see things differently. The shame in Frank's voice, the regret in his eyes, made John realize that the line between good and bad wasn't as clear-cut as he had once thought. Everyone had a past. Everyone had made mistakes. And sometimes, redemption wasn't just about asking for forgiveness. It was about facing the full weight of your actions and owning up to what you had done. "Why are you telling me this?" John asked, his voice low. Frank met his gaze, his eyes filled with something John couldn't quite place. "Because I see a lot of myself in you," Frank said. "You think you can run from your past, but you can't. It always catches up with you, and you've got to decide what you're going to do when it does." John flinched at Frank's words. He wasn't sure how to respond. He had spent his entire life running from the consequences of his actions, running from the people he had hurt, running from the shame he had buried deep inside. But Frank was right. It was catching up to him. And now, sitting in this room with Frank, he had no choice but to confront it. "You really think I can change?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank's eyes softened. "It's not about changing overnight, John. It's about facing who you are, owning up to what you've done, and doing the work to make it right. If you can do that, you might just find something worth saving. But if you keep running, you'll end up like me, always looking over your shoulder, never able to escape." The silence that followed was heavy. John could feel the weight of Frank's words pressing down on him. He had always been the one in control, the one who manipulated situations to his advantage. But now, in this moment, he realized that he was the one who had been deceived. He had deceived himself into thinking he was above the consequences of his actions. But Frank's confession was a cold reminder that no one was above the truth. John took a deep breath, trying to process everything Frank had said. "I don't know if I can fix what I've done," he admitted quietly. "I don't know if I'm even capable of making things right." Frank gave a small, knowing smile. "No one's perfect, but you've got to try. That's all any of us can do. Just try." For the first time since arriving at the shelter, John didn't feel like he was completely alone. There was a small flicker of hope inside him, a realization that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond redemption. But he also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had a long way to go before he could ever begin to atone for what he had done. And that, more than anything, terrified him. But as Frank stood up and walked away, leaving John to process his words, John realized something. This was his moment. This was the moment where he could either face the truth or keep running. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what would happen if he kept running. John had spent the next few days trying to make sense of everything that Frank had said. There was a strange weight to the words, a truth that had begun to crack open parts of him that he had long buried. For the first time, he was questioning his own motivations, his greed, his arrogance, the empire he had built on the backs of others. Frank's confession had stirred something in him, something that both frightened and fascinated him. But John wasn't ready to face all of that yet. He was still trying to get through each day without losing himself entirely, without collapsing under the pressure of the truths he was beginning to acknowledge. The shift came on a Wednesday afternoon when everything in the shelter seemed to pause. John was in the common area, helping set up for lunch, when he noticed a tall, stern-looking man walking through the door. His clothes were impeccably neat. Dark suit, tie, polished shoes. It was a stark contrast to the worn-out uniforms and simple clothes of the shelter's residents. The man exuded authority, and his eyes scanned the room with calculated precision. John watched as the man approached Mrs. Thompson, who was standing near the entrance, overseeing the arrival of a new batch of donations. The detective didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this. He looked like someone who was used to being in control, someone who didn't have to explain himself. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine as the man spoke to Mrs. Thompson. Their conversation was brief but intense, and John couldn't help but overhear parts of it. "I'm Detective Harris," the man said, his voice steady but sharp. "I'm here regarding Frank Matthews. We have reason to believe he's been hiding out here." John froze, his heart skipping a beat. Frank? Hiding out? The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known Frank was running from something, everyone did, but he hadn't realized the extent of it. And now it seemed like Frank's past was about to catch up with him in a way neither of them could avoid. Detective Harris didn't seem to notice John standing nearby as he continued to speak to Mrs. Thompson, his voice low and controlled. "We have reason to believe that Frank has been involved in more than just financial fraud. He's connected to a much larger operation, one that's still ongoing. We need to find him before things escalate." John's thoughts raced. What had Frank gotten himself into? What kind of danger was he in? And, more importantly, what kind of danger was the shelter in now? Mrs. Thompson's face was stoic, but there was a visible tension in her posture. "I haven't seen him," she said, her voice even, though John could hear the slight tremor in it. "But if you're looking for him, you'll need a warrant." The detective didn't flinch at her resistance. "We've got everything we need," he replied. "We're just trying to find out where he's hiding. If you hear anything, you need to let us know. Understand?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "I understand." John watched the exchange with growing anxiety. The shelter was meant to be a sanctuary for people who had nowhere else to go, people who were looking for a fresh start. But now, it was under the watchful eye of the law, and it wasn't clear whether the people who lived here would ever be safe again. The detective turned and began to leave, but not before his sharp gaze landed on John, who had been standing in the corner, listening. John didn't look away, even though he felt like he was being sized up, judged. "Mr. Davis," Detective Harris said, his tone colder now, "you've been here for a while, haven't you?" John didn't answer right away. He had to force himself to speak. "Yeah, I'm here to serve my sentence." The detective studied him for a moment. "Good luck with that," he said, his voice full of an unspoken warning. "You might want to stay out of trouble while you're here." John's stomach twisted as the detective walked out the door, his presence leaving an uncomfortable weight in the air. Mrs. Thompson turned to him once the detective was gone. Her face was hard, unreadable. "Stay out of his way, John. This is bigger than you think, and it's about to get a lot worse for everyone here." John nodded, though his mind was spinning. He had thought that his biggest problem was serving time in this shelter, but now, with the detective's visit, everything had shifted. The shelter wasn't just a place for people to rebuild their lives anymore. It was now a target. And the man they had all been trying to protect, Frank, was at the center of it. Later that evening, as John sat alone in his room, the weight of the situation hit him harder than ever. Frank's past wasn't just something he could brush aside. It was something real, something dangerous. The detective's words rang in his mind. Frank was part of something bigger, something criminal. And now the shelter was caught in the crossfire. John couldn't stop thinking about Frank, about how he had opened up to him in a way he hadn't done with anyone else. He had confessed to his mistakes, to his past, and John had believed him. But now, with the arrival of Detective Harris, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. What had Frank really done? And more importantly, could John trust him? Could he trust anyone here? Everyone seemed to have secrets. Everyone seemed to be hiding something, even Mrs. Thompson. John stood up, pacing around the small room. He was caught between two worlds now, the world he had once ruled, full of wealth and deceit, and this new world, where survival was a daily struggle and the consequences of past mistakes could no longer be ignored. He didn't know what was coming next, but he could feel the storm on the horizon, and he knew that the decisions he made now would determine not just his future, but the future of everyone at the shelter. And as the night stretched on, John couldn't help but wonder, was Frank a man trying to change, or was he just another person hiding from the truth, like everyone else? The next few days at the shelter felt like a slow, burning fuse, crackling with tension and uncertainty. John found it harder and harder to ignore the weight of the situation. Detective Harris's visit had left him unsettled, and Frank's looming presence made everything feel more complicated. Frank had shared his past with John, admitted to his mistakes, and yet now, in the wake of the detective's inquiry, it was clear that there was more to the story, things John had no way of understanding. The shelter, once a place where John had felt detached, now felt like a battleground. The residents went about their daily routines, but there was a sense of unease in the air. Conversations were quieter, glances were exchanged behind hands, and no one seemed to want to be the first to bring up the topic of Frank's past. They were all caught in this strange limbo. John was no different. That evening, as John stood near the entrance, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he couldn't stop thinking about the crossroads he now found himself at. Frank's confession weighed on him, just like the words of the detective. Frank wasn't just some man trying to survive. Frank had been running from something bigger, something dangerous, and it seemed that now the shelter, along with everyone inside it, was at risk. John leaned against the wall, his mind racing. Should he ignore it all? Keep his head down? Do his time? And leave the shelter behind once his sentence was up? Or should he do something about it? Should he step in, protect Frank, and risk his own safety for someone who had been nothing more than a stranger just a few weeks ago? What would happen if the people Frank had wronged came after the shelter? He had a sinking feeling that there wasn't much time before things came to a head. The detective wasn't going to let it go. And the deeper John thought about it, the more he realized he had been lying to himself. This wasn't just about his community service. It wasn't about serving his time and leaving. This was about facing the consequences of the life he had lived, the people he had hurt, and the choices he had made. As John walked through the shelter later that night, he was confronted by the hard truth. This place was his test, a test that went beyond anything the court could have imposed. It was a test of character, of moral choices, of the consequences of actions, and more than that, it was a test of who he had become. The next morning, John found himself standing outside the office of Mrs. Thompson. He hadn't intended to speak to her, not in such an open way, but something had changed inside him. He could no longer ignore the storm that was brewing. The uncertainty had turned into urgency. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. She looked up from the stack of papers she was sorting. "What is it, John?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to phrase what he needed to say. But then the words came out, blunt and direct. "The detective. He's after Frank. And he's already started looking here. He's digging into his past. There's no way he's going to stop until he finds him." Mrs. Thompson's expression didn't change. She placed the papers down slowly, her fingers tight around the edges. "I know." John blinked. "You know? You knew he was coming for Frank?" Mrs. Thompson leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I had a feeling, and frankly, I was hoping it wouldn't come to this. But it has." So, what now? John pressed. What are we going to do about it? We can't just let Frank's past destroy this place. This shelter is all these people have. They've been through enough already. Mrs. Thompson's face softened. She studied John for a long moment before speaking. I'm not sure what we can do, John. I'm not sure what's even possible anymore. Frank's past. It's dangerous. And not just for him. It's dangerous for everyone here. John's mind raced. He couldn't just sit back and let things unfold the way they were meant to. He had seen the fear in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, the way she seemed torn between her duty to protect the residents and her need to protect Frank, a man who had no place to go and no one to turn to. And yet, as much as he wanted to protect Frank, there was a part of him that feared the fallout from his actions. If we hide Frank, John said slowly, what happens when the people after him find out? What happens if we're caught in the middle of all this? I don't know, she replied, her voice heavy with the weight of the uncertainty. But we can't let Frank become a liability to the others. And we can't let this place fall apart because of one person's mistakes. John clenched his jaw. So, we turn him in? We sell him out? Mrs. Thompson sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't want to make that choice, but Frank can't stay here forever. He's already putting everyone at risk. Then we need to do something, John said, his voice firm now. There's got to be a way to protect this place and protect Frank. I can't just watch this happen. We have to do something. Mrs. Thompson stared at him for a long time. What are you suggesting? She asked, her voice low and uncertain. I'm suggesting we find a way for Frank to leave, John said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. We get him out of here before things get worse. We find him a way to disappear, to go somewhere they can't find him. And we keep this place safe. Mrs. Thompson didn't say anything at first. She seemed to be weighing the idea, considering the consequences. John could see the internal struggle in her eyes. Do you really think that's possible? She asked quietly. I don't know, John replied, shaking his head. But I can't just let everything go to hell because we're too afraid to act. I've already done enough running in my life. It's time to stop. Mrs. Thompson leaned back in her chair, her gaze lingering on John. Finally, she nodded, as if making up her mind. All right. We'll do what we can. But this is going to be dangerous. And it's going to take everything we've got. John nodded. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was standing on the right side of something. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew this was the moment he had to make a stand. The choices ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would define him. The days after John's conversation with Mrs. Thompson were filled with a quiet urgency. Wordlessly, they began to make plans. Mrs. Thompson gathered the key people in the shelter, those she trusted most, and explained the gravity of the situation. Frank's past had finally caught up with him, and now the shelter was at risk. There was no going back. The detective would return, and when he did, things would get much worse for everyone involved. John found himself spending most of his time avoiding the rest of the residents, staying out of their way while he worked on helping Mrs. Thompson put the pieces together. She wasn't fully on board with his idea, but she had agreed to at least consider it, an escape plan for Frank, one that would get him out of harm's way without putting the shelter in further jeopardy. Mrs. Thompson's eyes, usually so steady and certain, seemed clouded with doubt. But John could see the weight on her shoulders. She was doing her best to hold the entire shelter together, trying to protect the people who had trusted her. But Frank was no small matter. His actions had made enemies, and those enemies wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. After a few days of careful planning and consideration, John's resolve had only hardened. There was a strange sense of purpose in him now, something he had never felt before. It wasn't about avoiding the consequences of his actions anymore. It was about making sure that Frank, the man who had opened up to him in a way few people had, didn't face the wrath of the past alone. "How do we even begin?" John asked one evening as he sat down with Mrs. Thompson in her office. The rest of the staff had left for the night, leaving the two of them alone to discuss the final steps of their plan. Mrs. Thompson looked at him, a grim determination in her eyes. "I've been in touch with a few people outside the shelter, contacts who owe me favors from the past. They might be able to help Frank disappear, give him a new identity, a safe place to go." John felt a sense of relief at the mention of this. Mrs. Thompson had her network, people who had been there for her in the past when she needed them most. It was their best shot at protecting Frank. "Do you trust them?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Trust was something Mrs. Thompson had built over years of working in this environment. She didn't trust anyone easily, but when she did, it ran deep. "I trust them more than I trust the police right now," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. John let out a breath, unsure of how he felt about this. On one hand, he knew what Frank had done. He had betrayed people, ruined lives for the sake of power and greed. But on the other hand, Frank had shown him a side of himself that was broken, vulnerable. And after everything they'd been through together in the shelter, John wasn't about to turn his back on him. The plan was set. Mrs. Thompson would make the necessary arrangements with her contacts, and they would get Frank out of the shelter before Detective Harris or anyone else had a chance to find him. The rest of the residents would never know the full truth, only that Frank had left under mysterious circumstances. John couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom, though. Every time the door to the shelter opened, his eyes darted to the entryway, half expecting to see the detective's cold eyes staring back at him. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone was on edge, wondering when the next shoe would drop. Would the detective come back? Was Frank really safe? Was any of this going to work? Then, one night, the worst happened. John had just finished cleaning up after dinner when he saw Mrs. Thompson standing near the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with worry. She was speaking with one of the shelter's staff, but John could tell something was wrong. He approached cautiously. "What's going on?" he asked, his heart sinking. Mrs. Thompson turned to him, her face grim. "It's Detective Harris. He's here." John's breath caught in his throat. He had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, he found himself frozen, unsure of what to do next. He glanced around the room. Everything seemed normal, and yet the air felt thicker, charged with an undercurrent of fear. "Is Frank here?" John asked, his voice low. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Yes, and I'm not sure how much time we have." The detective had arrived earlier than expected. He had no idea about the plan, and Frank had no idea that his past was about to catch up with him. The timing couldn't have been worse. John's mind raced. There was no way they could allow the detective to find Frank now, not after everything they had worked toward. If the detective found Frank, it would all fall apart. The shelter, its residents, Frank's future, everything was at risk. "Where is he?" John asked, his voice tight with urgency. "He's in the back room, hiding," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But we need to act quickly. He can't stay here any longer." John's heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't think. He just moved. The back room was dimly lit, and John found Frank sitting in a corner, looking more tense than John had ever seen him. His eyes were wide, darting toward the door as if he expected the worst. "Frank," John said, his voice urgent, "we need to go. Now." Frank stood up, but his movements were hesitant. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Detective Harris is here," John said, grabbing Frank's arm. "We need to get you out, right now. You're not safe here anymore." Frank's eyes widened with fear. He knew this was the end of the line for him, but there was no time to argue. John helped him gather a few belongings, enough to get by, and rushed him out through the back door where Mrs. Thompson's contact was waiting with a car. "Everything's set," the contact said, his voice low and calm, as though this was just another night of running. "We'll get him out of here. No one will find him." John didn't question the plan. He didn't have time to. He just needed Frank to be safe. As the car drove off into the night, John watched the shelter disappear in the rearview mirror. He didn't know what the future held for Frank, but for the first time since he'd arrived at the shelter, John felt like he had done something right. But as the car turned a corner, the feeling of relief was replaced with something darker, something that John couldn't shake. This wasn't over. The storm was only just beginning. And even though Frank was out of the shelter, John knew that their choices had consequences. And sooner or later, those consequences would find them. The days following Frank's departure passed in a strange haze of uncertainty. John had done what he thought was right, helping Frank escape from the danger that was closing in on him. But even though Frank was gone, the shelter was still not out of the woods. Detective Harris had visited earlier in the week, and while they had managed to keep Frank hidden long enough to get him out of there, John knew it wouldn't be long before the detective came back. The law wasn't something that could be avoided forever, no matter how much one tried to hide from it. John had hoped that once Frank was gone, things would settle down, that the shelter would go back to the uneasy but peaceful rhythm it had known before Frank arrived. But it was different now. The air was thick with suspicion, and the residents could sense it. There were whispers, anxious glances exchanged when someone came or went, and everyone knew that something was off. The sense of safety they once had was gone. As the days turned into weeks, John found himself grappling with the consequences of his own choices. He had tried to protect Frank, to help him escape the past he could never outrun. But now, as he walked through the shelter's halls, he wondered if he had made the right decision. What if Frank's past had come with too high a cost? What if by saving Frank, John had risked everything he had come to care about? The residents had begun to ask questions. Some knew Frank had left under mysterious circumstances, others assumed he had simply moved on. But there was one person who had already begun to suspect the truth. Linda. The woman John had worked with in the garden, the one who had shared so much wisdom with him, had started to watch him more closely. She could tell something was different, even if no one else had figured it out yet. John saw her eyes flicker with understanding every time they passed in the hall. One evening, as John was preparing dinner, Linda came over to him. There was no one else around, just the quiet murmur of other residents in the background. "John," she said, her voice low, "I know what you did." John stiffened, his grip tightening around the knife he was holding. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know Frank didn't just leave," she said, her eyes steady. "I know you helped him." John's heart pounded in his chest. He had tried to keep everything quiet, to make sure no one would find out. But Linda had seen through it all. There was no point in denying it anymore. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her tone not accusatory, but filled with curiosity. "Why risk everything for him?" John sighed, putting down the knife. "I didn't have a choice. He needed help. I couldn't just let him go back to whatever he was running from." Linda nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she was letting on. "I get it. I really do." But you have to understand that we can't live in the past forever. We can't fix everyone." John glanced up at her, his expression tight. "I know that. I do. But Frank isn't just some criminal. He's not the man he used to be." Linda's gaze softened. "People don't just change overnight, John. It takes time. It takes real effort. You can't just sweep everything under the rug and expect it to go away." He didn't respond immediately. What could he say? Linda was right. Frank's past wasn't something that could be erased by a few good deeds. John had learned that the hard way, and now he had to face the reality that he might have made a dangerous decision. "Do you think I made a mistake?" John asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Linda met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "I think you did what you thought was right. But now, you've got to live with the consequences." And those consequences came sooner than John had hoped. The next day, Detective Harris returned. This time, he didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He knew everything he needed to know. The shelter had become his target, and Frank's departure had only intensified his search. Harris wasn't there to negotiate or threaten. He was there to make an example out of the shelter, to send a message to everyone who thought they could hide from the law. He walked straight to Mrs. Thompson's office, demanding answers. "Where is Frank Matthews?" he asked, his voice cold and unyielding. Mrs. Thompson didn't flinch. She knew what was coming. "I told you before. He left." The detective narrowed his eyes. "I don't believe that for a second, and neither do the people I'm working with." John had been walking down the hall when he overheard the conversation. His pulse quickened, and his stomach twisted with dread. This was it. The moment of reckoning. The detective wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, and it seemed there was no way to avoid the fallout now. He couldn't let it go any further. He couldn't let the shelter become a casualty of his own choices. Without thinking, he pushed open the door to Mrs. Thompson's office and stepped inside. "Detective," John said, his voice firm, "Frank isn't here, and I think you need to leave." The detective turned toward him, his eyes dark with irritation. "You think you can tell me what to do now, Mr. Davis?" he sneered. "You've been playing this game for too long. I'm done playing nice." John stood his ground, despite the fear that was creeping into his chest. "Frank's gone, and you won't find him here. So either you leave, or we handle this the hard way." The detective's eyes narrowed. "You think you can protect him? You think this shelter can hide him forever?" He stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "People like Frank always come back, Mr. Davis. And when they do, they bring destruction with them." John felt the weight of those words, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. Not now. "What's done is done," John said, "and the only thing left to do is let him go. There's nothing here for you to find anymore." The detective stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked out of the office. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the storm that had been gathering for so long had finally passed, leaving nothing but a hollow, lingering calm. John stood there, his breath coming in short bursts. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He had done what he could to protect Frank, to keep this place from falling apart. And now, he would face whatever came next, with the knowledge that he had finally stopped running. But as he looked at the door where the detective had left, John knew this was far from over. The consequences of his actions had only just begun to unfold.